Please remember to silence all cell phones and enjoy the show.
So, my friends, this has been a very difficult semester in some ways for myself and my wife, Dr. Hollyquist, with medical issues and other things, but, you know, the show must go on, as they say. So we decided to keep this date, and there's been a change to the initial program. Those of you who are expecting Elgar's Sonata are expecting goblins to dance today. Not going to happen. However, those of you who want goblins to dance, the famous Bazzini Dance of the Goblins, that will be performed in September instead, once we've had a chance to reset a few things. However, today is a very special day because originally we were going to have this piece still as part of the program today, which is the Journey into Fantasia, world premiere by my dear friend, Dr. Matthew M. Honas. It's going to be played today after a short intermission, but first, he is here, the composer is here in the flesh, right behind that door, and is going to give you guys a little taste of what it's like to be a composer in the 21st century and how he went about writing this piece. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Matthew M. Honas to our campus.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Silvers, for having me here.
Use the mic, please.
Sure, will do. My name is Matthew Honas, and I am very glad that I get to be with you here in Durango to talk about my new work, Journey into Fantasia. I'm actually going to move this just slightly back that way so we can make sure you can hear. Yep, perfect, thank you. So, to start, I wanted to thank Richard for commissioning the work. A bit about my relationship with Richard. In 2019, as part of my master's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I had written a piece in 24 hours for clarinet, violin, and cello titled Premonitions. At the time, I was familiar with Richard's performances, as he was very prolific around campus, but we hadn't yet been introduced. So I'm glad that he said yes, not only because he is a spectacular violinist, as I'm sure many of you know, but because we became close friends after, and we've worked together on several projects, but they were always duets or for large ensembles. So when he reached out to commission a new work, I was ecstatic for the opportunity to write a work for violin solo. So, yeah, this is his first time seeing it too, so he's excited as well. So before I begin, I wanted to give you some background information to help you understand the work. I'm a native of and currently operate out of Wichita, Kansas. I graduated summa cum laude from Kansas State University in 2017. I then earned my master's and doctorate in music composition from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was very fortunate to have lessons with Pulitzer Prize, Academy of the Arts, Guggenheim, and Grammy-winning composers, such as my major professor, Dr. Laura Schwenninger, along with John Harbison, Melinda Wagner, Paul Shihara, Sebastian Courier, and more. If you aren't familiar with their works, I highly recommend them. They are phenomenal composers and just great people in general to learn from their music. So, briefly, I would like to share with you a core belief of mine. This quote from the composer, Louis Andriessen, has always been close to my heart. He said that many composers view the act of composing as somehow above social conditioning. I contest that. How you arrange your musical material, the techniques you use, and the instruments you score for are largely determined by your own social circumstances and listening experience. And I have found that to be completely true. Because of this, to understand my music, it is always important to understand the context of the piece. My doctoral studies were a difficult time in my life as I was dealing with social distancing while a family member was diagnosed with a terminal illness. When I finished my degree and returned, however, it felt like I was resetting. It was a brand new journey waiting for me. Therefore, this piece acted like a way for me to journal and document my experiences of my adventure after grad school. Keeping these challenges I faced during my studies in mind, when you listen to my works, you can usually hear this turmoil come in through different avenues. For my works, I work with the full range of the chromatic scale. This allows me to continually shift through different keys like a kaleidoscope, so that it keeps us continually guessing where we might end up. And I have a couple of audio examples so you can hear what this sounds like in some of my other works. So I am a pianist. I've played piano since I was very young, so it's been about 23 years now that I've played piano. As a pianist, I love counterpoint and fugues. Because of this, I enjoy the idea of having multiple different lines working together. And here's actually one of the earlier pieces that I worked with Dr. Silvers on. When writing for a solo instrument like I am here, it's important to keep in mind that I still work with multiple different lines. They just happen in different registers, so in the upper register or the lower register. And I also use it through unique sounds on the instrument. So when you listen, keep track of how these unique sounds or lines change as the music progresses. I also like to contrast closely placed dissonances against large registrations. Really, anything that provides drama through stark contrast is something that I enjoy. Apparently that was stark for the audio. We had a little blowout there, sorry about that. Another aspect of my music to look out for is references to my Scandinavian and Volga German heritage.
From the mountains arose a giant named Saturn.
Finally, I also work to integrate extended techniques into the foundation of the work. So for those of you who aren't familiar, extended techniques are any ways of playing an instrument that are different than how it is normally played. And I'm going to ask Richard to demonstrate some of these for you. For instance, we are used to hearing the violin played normally. We all know what that sounds like. However, a violinist can also pluck the strings. So if you could pluck the strings for us. Yep, very good. Thank you. You didn't know this was an interactive experience, huh? So they can also tap strings with their bow on different parts of the instrument, knock on the instrument. Now, this is something I try to avoid for the violin because it's hard to balance. Yeah. I did that one time for him, and he said, "Please don't do that. I'm going to drop it." So I can't afford his instrument. So he can also stomp, right? Yeah. Or even make sounds with his mouth. Yeah. So we're going to hear all different varieties of these here. So the question is why? I've had a lot of my students ask this, why use extended techniques? Some of my students say, oh, they just want to be new, they want to be different. Well, a composer uses extended techniques so that they can mimic other instruments, add in different lines of music to play against the melody, provide momentum to move into another section, provide textural or timbral contrast, or to add surprise and maintain attention. So when you listen to my music, think about all the different meanings that these may provide and how they help move the story along. Now, looking at Journey into Fantasia, when I started composing the work, I wanted to think about the overall structure first, as this would help me to shape the work from beginning to end to give it the feeling of a story. To start, 3 is a really important number to me, and I knew that the work needed to be anywhere from 12 to 14 minutes long. This led me to use 3 movements, as it would allow me to balance the overall timing of the work well. Now that I had the number of movements, I wanted to figure out the overarching shape of the work. To do this, one staple of my works is that I like to reference traditional structures in music. In the Romantic era, a very common trope was to use the idea of the hero's journey. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this concept, it is a plot narrative that is used in much of what you come into contact with in film and in books today. So briefly, to take you through one of the most famous examples, I will use scenes from Star Wars. So first you have a character who starts out where they are comfortable, right? They really don't want to go anywhere. They may feel forlorn, right? They then come into contact with a guide who can either be physical, spiritual, or magical, who offers them a quest. However, they initially do reject this call to leave, but they ultimately decide to go anyways. On this quest, they meet trials, villains, and their ultimate obstacle. They are initially successful, but face one final challenge. The hero then goes through a resurrection and succeeds. They then journey back home, having completed their adventure. So this outline was used many times in the 19th century for music, but with the advent of the World Wars, it fell out of fashion as composers looked to new styles and trends, as well as performance techniques, so they could aptly describe the horrors of the wars and explore new avenues of music composition. So thinking about all of this, I asked myself, what would my take on the hero's journey be? I didn't necessarily want to fall into film tropes of bombastic music for the onset of the journey, undulating trills and tremolos for the tests, and then heroic music for the return. However, it did give me a good guideline for how I would set up the piece. I broke the hero's journey into 3 sections for each of the movements. Movement 1 would be that call to adventure, right? And the hero's reluctance to accept that call. Movement 2 would be tests and hardships on the adventure. Finally, movement 3 would be the aftermath of the hero's success and their journey home. Now that I had a rough idea of the form, I wanted to come up with an overarching story or theme for the piece. As mentioned, the overall title of the work is Journey into Fantasia. I have long been fascinated by works where the world around us shifts and warps into something magical. Think of important works like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, paintings by Salvador Dali, Studio Ghibli films such as The Boy and the Heron, Howl's Moving Castle, or Spirited Away. If you haven't seen those, I would highly recommend them. Or even music from Pauline Oliveros, where she uses recordings of other music and then warps it through electronics into something magical. It was this concept that led me to the title. Interestingly enough, Fantasia takes on a quadruple entendre here. Firstly, looking at the base word, Fantasia is our ability to visualize or to create mental images of an imaginary world around us. Secondly, the word sounds similar to that of fantastic. Here, I use fantastic to mean imaginative or distant from reality. However, if you spell fantastic with a PH, like I've done here, it is an outdated word that means strange, weird, fanciful, or exaggerated in an unrealistic way. Finally, the word is a reference to the musical genre Fantasia, which is a free-form composition for an instrumental soloist, sound familiar? That is not bound by traditional forms. So, knowing that I wanted to place the everyday through a surreal lens, I chose to use my everyday experiences after leaving grad school to shape the work. As I have been working in the yard at my hometown, and these are some of the flowers there, I've been frequently surprised at the variety of animals and creatures that appear, even though I'm surrounded by a large, busy city. So each movement was based on a few of the creatures I have found in my garden. Movement 1 is based on fireflies, movement 2 comes from a pit bull, and movement 3 is our neighborhood fox. That one was a surprise. I didn't know there were any foxes living nearby, but I was very happy for the piece. So for the title of each movement, I followed the precedent I set by following literary allusions. So the first movement, Elan Vital, takes its name from the term coined by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who uses it to explain the impetus needed to generate life. In the hero's journey, the hero often needs some push to leap into adventure. In literature, fireflies often symbolize hope and guidance, and they often push you to explore and choose new things, right? So this is why I chose fireflies as the representative creature for the first movement. The lights that blink out of the darkness act as an invitation for the hero to stop, explore, and start something new. To represent this, the opening of the piece is long and slow, which is suddenly juxtaposed by a single pizzicato. This feels extremely evocative to me, as I am finding the magic in everyday life. These pizzicatos are like fireflies, which blink into existence. If you ever have seen firefly mating rituals, it's quite special. Fireflies have developed specific blinking patterns and flying patterns for each region of the world. In Kansas, fireflies will blink in and then float towards the sky like embers floating off of a flame. It feels quite magical. So after the opening figure, I have a pizzicato that does the same, and Richard's going to demonstrate that here. You can hear how it just floated upwards, right? Okay. The pluck string seems to float magically before dissipating. In the first movement, when you hear long-held notes, imagine the sun setting as the sky turns indigo. Each pizzicato is like an orb of yellow which floats towards the stars. I want you to notice how in the first movement, when the violin plays its long-held notes, they are usually in the upper register of the instrument, while the plucked notes are below. This is to represent the earth and the stars representing that magical world which is slightly out of reach. If you listen carefully, this creates the illusion that there are actually two instruments playing, not one. I mentioned that earlier, right? The bowed violin represents one voice, while the pizzicato creates a contrapuntal line underneath. Near the end of the work, the two different materials become entangled and almost difficult to differentiate. This represents the illusion between fantasy and the real world to set up moving into the next movement. Moving on to the second movement, I did want to note I will spend a bit more time discussing this movement to give more insight into the compositional process. It takes me about 30 to 40 hours for each movement. There's a lot that goes into planning and then actually executing it. But I especially want to talk about this one here, because second movements traditionally are where composers experiment with new forms, sounds, and ideas. And here, I know that second movements are usually slow, and I wanted to do the opposite, which would be fast. And I also wanted it to include the overall climax of the work, but I still wanted it to be a section where I could experiment with that form. So, the second movement's title is Danza di Vado Mori, which once again comes from literature. It's a 13th century genre of Italian poetry, where a poet from any walk of life or social status would lament that they were about to die. Continuing with the hero's journey, after the hero has crossed the threshold, they encounter enemies, challenges, and obstacles. Here I wanted a creature that represented this threat and danger to the hero. After much consideration, I decided on the pit bull after my mother and dog were attacked by a pit bull during their walk. So, without getting into too much detail, you can see from this photo on the screen that we were fortunate that Scout's collar was tight enough that the pit bull had a hard time latching onto his throat. Fortunately, both my mother and dog survived the attack. However, not too long after, a second pit bull moved nearby who frequently barks and charges the fence while we are outside. This attack is why the second movement was given the title Danza di Vado Mori and was based on the pit bull. Before diving into the musical material, I want to note that I work to tailor each piece to who I'm writing for. I know that Dr. Silvers is a huge fan of metal. As such, I wanted the second movement to incorporate some inspirations from metal, as it is full of rich musical material, and there are lots of sounds and techniques that I can draw from. I also found this to be a perfect representation for the danger that the hero would be going through, as I could include drastic changes in dynamics, register articulations, and more that the hero would have to overcome. But I still wanted it to be fun, right? And metal allowed me to include that as well. So for rhythm, so to do this, I brought over many of the techniques used in metal into the second movement. For instance, metal includes a complex use of vibrato. There are moments where I incorporate specific vibrato notations where you can see I put non-vibrato there, which means don't use any, right? And this is to emulate how it is traditionally used in metal. I also include overpressure and glissando to reference screeches in both the electric guitar and voice. For rhythm, I use quick 16th note figures with endings that spiral off in different directions. And if you could demonstrate that, Richard, please. Yeah. Yeah, it's fun. The second movement is so much fun to listen to. I heard it for the first time yesterday, and I was floored. So, okay, so yeah. Most people are like, wait, you heard it for the first time? Yeah, composers usually don't hear it until the day before. So I also include tuplets that blur meters and feel like they add additional beats to the measure. So if you could demonstrate this one as well. Yeah, I like that. Okay, rapid embellishments that highlight specific notes or phrases. All right. Mm-hmm. And figures that sound like strummed chords. And this is the last I'll have you do. Yeah, nice. Okay. I also look at registral effects, such as how the color and dynamics change when the instrument is in the lower, mid, and upper registers. And I work to emulate this on the violin as well. Finally, the form is often complex and varies, so I work to make sure that the form of the piece allowed for this as well, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. Now, looking at some of the extended techniques used in this movement, I really wanted the movement to retell the story of what my mother and dog had to go through. As such, the second movement starts with a violent attack of the strings. I then follow this with two undulating, plucked figures, one loud and one soft, to show the pit bull and the chihuahua who is following him. I didn't bring this up, but there was a small, tiny chihuahua as well. Okay. Yeah, so it's almost like dog tags, right? Yeah. To show the different events of the attack, I used various figures. Overpressure or screeching material shows the fangs of the pit bull, and if you could show that here. Nice, okay. Plucked figures later on show blood droplets. Yeah, awesome. And stomps show my mother trying to defend Scout and much more. Yeah, okay. So for each section, now talking about this, I mentioned briefly that I really wanted to experiment with the form and to have it be dynamic and changing. So I use a compositional process that I don't normally use, and I wanted to show the chaotic string of events, but also how traumatic stories are usually recounted using short, urgent phrases. So I created cells of music. So I just literally sat down and composed, okay, here's one idea, here's another idea, and you can see that there, right? There was no particular order. In this way, I could carry over the ever-shifting focus of the story and its short yet complete thoughts. But here I've now added some connective tissue in between and reorganized it. And then you can see here how it was then translated. It becomes much more complex in there. Finally, I wanted to include a reference to the pit bull's continual presence in our life. As I mentioned earlier, we have a new pit bull nearby that has been constantly there. So I transcribed the rhythm and pitch of his barking. Finally, I placed this over the top of my finished piece. This way, the barking continually interrupts the musical content to heighten the intensity of the work. Lastly, I want to briefly talk about the final movement. Where the second movement represents overcoming obstacles and challenges, the final movement, on the other hand, represents the hero's journey back home. Oftentimes in the Romantic era, this was seen as a triumphant affair. However, I wondered about what if the hero was victorious and yet exhausted? All right? I wanted this piece to feel as if the trials had almost completely worn them down to nothing. This is where the final movement, Tuliketu, gets its name. At night, our streets by my house are often visited by a local fox. Because of this, I wanted to find a myth that not only fit my overarching story, but represented a fox. Therefore, I chose Tuliketu. Tuliketu is the name of a firefox in Finnish mythology. During the day, the fox is gray and ashen, looking almost death-like. But during the night, its tail sparks and sets the sky afire with the northern lights. To represent the burden of the pitbull attack and yet how we barely overcame it, the movement begins with a funeral march. As the day once again becomes night, sparks of light, represented by overtones in the violin, light up the night sky. This creates a stark contrast between the ethereal upper register and the grounded pizzicatos and earthy figures of the lower register to show the reawakening of the night sky as it morphs into dawn. As I conclude, there's a lot more that I could have discussed about the piece, but these are a few things to listen for during the performance. See if there are any other interpretations, stories, or references that you can hear. Thank you for your time, and after a brief intermission, I look forward to presenting to you the world premiere performance of Journey into Fantasia.
with our programs, whether it's in music or theater or musical theater, for coming and seeing the Performing Arts Department and the productions that our students, most of whom are in this area over here, work so hard on, whether it's great recitals. And so I want to first thank our students for being so great. They are what make this happen. And then a couple of my colleagues are here, so I want to recognize Dr. Justin Hubbard. And then Doctors Holly Quist and Catherine Jetter. And then, of course, thank you to everyone in the booth who makes us, as Steph Cap said earlier, sound great and look great. Yes, we appreciate that. Some of us really need that help, so thank you. And then, last but not least, Shauna Blaylock for organizing. So, this was the final program, I think, in our department for the semester, so we look forward to seeing you in the fall, so in August and September, probably September. Dr. Quist will be doing a piano recital on the first day of school in August. So thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day.